There is a mission being planned right now that will take human beings further from Earth than any human being has ever traveled, and the people designing it have solved almost every problem, except the most important one. The rockets exist, or are being built. SpaceX's Starship, the most powerful launch vehicle in human history, has conducted multiple full-stack flight tests and is iterating toward the reusability and orbital refueling capability that a Mars transit architecture requires. NASA's Orion spacecraft has already flown beyond the Moon and returned, proving the heat shield, the life support systems, and the navigation software that any deep space crew will depend on. The propulsion is understood. The trajectory mathematics have been computed and recomputed for decades. Radiation-hardened electronics, pressurized habitat modules, carbon dioxide scrubbers, water recycling systems, food packaging that survives multi-year storage. Engineers have spent entire careers solving each of these problems, and the solutions, while imperfect, are real. The biological machine that metabolizes food, breathes air, and moves through pressurized modules, that problem is largely understood. You feed it, you water it, you give it oxygen, you keep it from freezing, and it survives. Survival is a solved problem. What nobody has solved is what happens to the part of the biological machine that makes decisions. The consciousness problem in deep space is not a science fiction concern. It is not the lonely astronaut staring out a porthole in a movie. It is a documented, measured, physiologically verified reality that the world's leading space medicine researchers are actively studying right now, with results serious enough that multiple peer-reviewed journals, multiple NASA internal risk assessments, and multiple independent research groups have independently concluded the same thing. The human brain, the 3-pound organ that navigation, engineering judgment, conflict resolution, medical diagnosis, and mission survival all depend on, begins to change in measurable, structural, and, in some cases, potentially irreversible ways when you remove it from the environment it spent 4 billion years of evolution inside. The brain on Earth breathes filtered air at sea level pressure. It sleeps in aligned circadian rhythms cued by a sun that rises and sets on a predictable schedule. It receives constant gravitational cues that regulate fluid distribution from the top of the skull to the bottom of the feet. It shelters behind a planetary magnetic field and a thick atmosphere that together reduce galactic cosmic ray exposure to a background whisper. And it communicates with its support network, its colleagues, its physicians, its family, its entire institutional support structure in real time, with zero latency, with no possibility that the connection will be severed for weeks at a time. Remove every one of those conditions simultaneously. Point the vessel at a target that sits between 54 million and 401 million kilometers away, depending on where the two planets are in their orbits. Impose a communication delay that ranges from 3 minutes to 45 minutes each way, and that drops to 0 during solar conjunction when the sun blocks the signal entirely. Then ask that brain that changed, stressed, sleep-deprived, radiation-exposed, fluid-shifted, socially isolated brain to perform field surgery on a crew member, to diagnose a life support failure at 3 in the morning, to navigate a surface landing in a vehicle nobody has ever landed on another planet before, and to mediate a conflict between exhausted colleagues without making a single catastrophic error. That is the challenge. It is the one that no rocket, no heat shield, no propellant depot, and no solar panel array can address. It requires a different kind of engineering, entirely the engineering of environments, protocols, countermeasures, and mission architectures that keep the human mind functional across the full duration of the most isolated, most demanding, most unforgiving journey our species has ever attempted. If you want to understand why the most serious researchers in human spaceflight treat the mind as the last unsolved frontier, not the rocket, not the life support system, the mind, Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because understanding this changes everything about how humanity actually gets to Mars and what it means to survive the journey. Let's begin with what we actually know, not what we imagine, not what 50 years of science fiction has trained the cultural imagination to assume. What verified, peer-reviewed, independently reproduced observation has demonstrated about what happens to a human brain when you take it off this planet and point it towards something far away. The timing of this question matters. 20 years ago, the question was largely academic. The nearest Mars mission was indefinitely deferred. The data on long-duration spaceflight came from a handful of cosmonauts who had spent extended periods on Mir, and the research field was relatively small. Today, the question is operational. Multiple nations and multiple commercial entities are building hardware that will carry human beings to Mars within the coming decades, on timelines that are compressed enough that the research programs designed to understand the cognitive risks need to be generating validated countermeasures in years, not decades. The urgency is real. The gap between the urgency of the mission timeline and the maturity of the human performance research that needs to inform it is one of the defining tensions in current human spaceflight planning. Understanding that gap, honestly, is not an act of pessimism. It is the prerequisite for closing it. Every serious conversation about human cognition in deep space makes the same mistake that every serious conversation about lunar settlement makes. It collapses four profoundly different things into a single category, labels the category with a softening word, challenges, risks, factors, and moves on to the engineering section. It hears psychological challenges and fills in the rest from somewhere between a NASA press release and a movie about a botanist stranded on Mars. The assumption that emerges is that stress is manageable, that adaptation is expected, that degradation is optional, and that permanent change belongs to science fiction. None of those assumptions are accurate, and the difference between those four categories is not a difference of degree, it is a difference of kind. Treating them interchangeably leads to mission architectures that ask human brains to perform at peak cognitive capacity throughout missions that measurably reduce peak cognitive capacity and then express institutional surprise when something goes wrong. The first category is acute stress response. This is the body and mind reacting to a novel, extreme environment the first days and weeks of a space mission, when almost every sensory input the nervous system has been receiving for an entire lifetime suddenly changes. Heart rate elevates, cortisol spikes. Sleep fragments as the circadian system tries to synchronize to an environment with no natural light-dark cycle that makes biological sense. The vestibular system, the balance and orientation mechanism in the inner ear, registers the complete absence of the gravitational pull it has been receiving since before birth and responds with confusion, disorientation, and nausea. Fluid shifts toward the head, producing a sensation of fullness in the face and sinuses. The digestive system reorganizes. All of this is normal, expected, documented across hundreds of spaceflight missions dating back to Vostok and Mercury, and crucially, all of it resolves partly or fully within the first weeks of a mission. Vestibular adaptation to microgravity typically completes within a week to 10 days. Sleep improves as the crew implements structured lighting schedules and behavioral routines. The acute stress response is the whole story for short missions. It is manageable, temporary, and does not define the consciousness problem in deep space. The second category is adaptive, change the body and brain, having stabilized from the initial shock, making longer-term structural adjustments to the new environment. Bone density decreases because the mechanical stimulus that maintains bone mass, the constant loading of weight-bearing skeleton against Earth's gravitational field, has been removed. At measured rates of approximately 1 to 2% per month in load-bearing bones, an astronaut who spends 6 months in microgravity loses bone density equivalent to what a person on Earth loses in roughly a decade. Muscles atrophy for the same reason the body is economical and does not maintain mass in structures that are not being used. The cardiovascular system recalibrates because the heart no longer needs to pump blood against a strong gravitational gradient. Red blood cell mass decreases in a process space physicians call space anemia, reducing oxygen carrying capacity and contributing to fatigue throughout the mission. For the brain specifically, cerebrospinal fluid, the clear liquid that cushions and bathes the brain and spinal cord, flowing through the spaces between brain and skull and through the ventricles inside the brain, redistributes in microgravity in ways that have no terrestrial equivalent. On Earth, gravity draws a portion of this fluid downward. In microgravity, the fluid accumulates around the brain in volumes and pressures. The skull was not designed to accommodate indefinitely. The ventricles inside the brain expand. Grey matter volume changes in specific regions. The brain physically shifts upward within the skull, a finding that in any terrestrial patient would prompt urgent neurological investigation, and that in space, medicine has become documented enough among returning long-duration crew to have generated its own clinical research subfield. These changes are real, quantified, and most of them are partially reversible. The bone density eventually comes back, slowly, with exercise and restored gravitational loading. Cardiovascular function recalibrates on return to Earth. Brain fluid redistribution gradually normalizes over weeks to months after landing. Adaptive change is the physiological cost of a 6-month ISS tour, and it has been deemed acceptable given the mission benefits. The critical qualification is that this acceptability judgment was made for 6-month missions, 400 kilometers from Earth, with a ground team in real-time communication and an emergency return option available within 24 hours. Mars is none of those things, not a single one. The third category is where the comfortable language of manageability begins to fail. The distinction between adaptive change and functional degradation is not semantic. Adaptive change is neutral, the body responding to a new environment in ways that maintain adequate function within that environment. Functional degradation is directional, measurable decline in the performance of systems the mission operationally depends on. Decline that does not represent adaptation, but impairment. Not the body reorganizing itself to function in a new context. Actual decline. Cognitive processing speed slows in the performance of systems the mission operationally depends on. Not the body adapting to a new environment. Actual decline. Cognitive processing speed slows on standardized tests administered during flight compared to the same tests administered before launch. Working memory capacity decreases the mental workspace that holds information in mind while using it, essential to any complex task, from instrument reading to surgical procedure to emergency navigation. Attention and executive functions show detectable impairment, measured not in subjective reports from fatigued astronauts with career-based reasons to underreport, but in objective computerized performance metrics that do not care about career consequences. Reaction time increases. Decision-making under time pressure becomes less reliable. Emotional regulation declines as accumulated fatigue compounds with isolation stress. Sleep quality, rather than stabilizing at the adaptation period baseline, continues to deteriorate progressively as the mission extends. It is worth pausing on the word measurable because in the context of cognitive performance research, it carries specific meaning that the casual use of the word can obscure. These are not theoretical projections from computational models, not estimates derived from extrapolating animal data, not the impressionistic assessments of colleagues who noticed that someone seemed a bit slower after a long mission. They are findings from real astronauts, tested systematically before, during, and after real missions, using validated cognitive assessment instruments, the same instruments that neurologists use in clinical practice to track conditions like mild cognitive impairment and early dementia. When the same tests that identify the beginning of cognitive decline in aging populations show declining performance in returning astronauts, the finding deserves exactly the clinical attention that would be given to those same findings in a neurology clinic. The fact that the decline is partial, reversible, and less severe than clinical dementia does not make it irrelevant to a mission architecture that depends on peak cognitive performance at specific critical moments. A surgeon whose performance was measurably below their own pre-illness baseline would not be cleared for complex procedures until performance recovered. An astronaut whose cognitive performance is measurably below their pre-mission baseline is being asked, in current mission architecture, to complete the most cognitively demanding phase of the mission. The NASA twin study gave these findings their most rigorous and most publicly visible expression. Scott Kelly spent approximately 1 year aboard the International Space Station between March 2015 and March 2016, while his identical twin brother Mark, himself a former astronaut, offering a uniquely controlled comparison, remained on Earth. The twin design is genuinely powerful here. Scott and Mark share essentially identical genetics, meaning that differences in their measured outcomes across the study period can be attributed with unusual confidence to the effects of the spaceflight itself, rather than to pre-existing biological differences. The study enrolled multiple research teams, examining everything from gene expression to gut microbiome to cognitive performance, and the results were striking across nearly every system examined. The cognitive findings were among the most concerning. Scott's scores on tests of cognitive speed and accuracy declined during his year in space and had not fully returned to his pre-mission baseline at the 6-month post-return follow-up point. Not a catastrophic decline, not the kind of impairment that would announce itself in daily conversation or raise obvious operational concerns in casual observation. A measurable, consistent, statistically significant reduction in the precision and speed of the cognitive instrument that every other aspect of mission performance depends on. The study also found changes in telomere length, in gene expression patterns, in microbiome composition, and in inflammatory markers that pre-flight assumptions had not fully anticipated. Some of these changes reversed on return to Earth, some did not. The integrated picture from examining multiple biological systems simultaneously in the same individual across the same mission timeline was not simply the sum of what individual system studies had previously suggested the whole was. More complex than the parts, and in certain respects more concerning. And all of this was 1 year in low Earth orbit, with a communication delay measured in fractions of a second, with a fully equipped mission control team monitoring every parameter and ready to respond, with an emergency return option available at all times. Mars is none of those things, not a single one. The cognitive findings from the twin study also connected to something the research community had been seeing in other forms across multiple independent studies, and that deserved the attention it was not yet receiving in public. Discussion. The changes were not random noise or study artifacts. They were systematic, directional, and biologically plausible, given everything else known about how the space environment affects the brain. When the same direction of finding reduced cognitive performance, structural brain changes, physiological alterations across multiple systems emerges from multiple independent research groups using different methods, different subjects, and different outcome measures. The cross-study consistency is itself a finding. The pattern was consistent. The space environment does something measurable and meaningful to the brain. The twin study gave that finding its most rigorous demonstration, and the honest reading of what it demonstrated is more concerning than the press coverage suggested. The fourth category is structural alteration, changes to the physical architecture of the brain that persist after return to Earth, that appear to accumulate with mission duration, and whose long-term consequences for cognition and neurological health are not yet fully characterized. White matter changes in returning astronauts altered signal in the brain's communication pathways. The insulated axon bundles that carry information between regions have been documented in multiple studies and are associated, in clinical populations on Earth, with elevated risk of cognitive decline and neurological disease. They appear in people with chronic hypertension, occupational neurotoxin exposure, early Alzheimer's disease. They appear also in astronauts who have spent long periods in space, in patterns that suggest something specific to the space environment rather than simply aging. The brain that returns from a long mission is not identical to the brain that departed. These four categories matter because they demand different responses, and confusing one for another produces responses that are inadequate to the actual problem. Acute stress is managed with preparation and psychological support. Adaptive change is monitored and mitigated with countermeasures. Functional degradation must be accounted for in mission architecture. You cannot design a Mars vehicle that requires peak cognitive performance at every moment, because peak performance will not be present at every moment throughout a 20-month transit. Structural alteration must be characterized and actively mitigated before we ask human beings to accumulate it for 20 months in exchange for the privilege of being first. When a NASA official describes the psychological and cognitive challenges of a Mars mission as manageable, they are usually talking about Category 1, occasionally about Category 2, rarely about Category 3, and almost never about Category 4. The language is carefully chosen. The findings are not soft in the same way. What follows is the honest account of what those findings actually show, starting with the hazard that most space medicine researchers privately describe as the one that keeps them awake, and the one that generates the least public attention because it is invisible, has no immediate symptoms, and cannot be blocked by anything currently available on any spacecraft being built anywhere on Earth. On the night of August 2nd, 1972, the Sun did something that would have killed every human being on the lunar surface, if any human beings had been on the lunar surface at the time. A massive solar particle event erupted from the Sun's corona, accelerating a storm of high-energy protons outward through the inner solar system at a velocity approaching a significant fraction of the speed of light. The Apollo 16 crew had returned to Earth 2 months earlier. The Apollo 17 crew would not launch until December. That specific window, that summer and autumn of 1972, was the only gap in the entire Apollo lunar surface program during which the Sun produced an event of that magnitude. 6 missions, 3 years, 1 extreme solar event, and it arrived between missions 12 and 13. Nobody planned that timing. Luck arranged it, and luck is not a radiation countermeasure. The August 1972 event was large enough that unshielded astronauts on the lunar surface would have received an acute radiation dose estimated at more than 10 gray to the skin and approximately 2 gray to the bone marrow. 2 gray to bone marrow causes acute radiation syndrome, severe nausea and vomiting within hours of exposure, followed by immunosuppression as white blood cell counts drop, followed by hemorrhaging as platelet production fails, and potentially by death if the bone marrow's blood-forming capacity cannot recover. The skin dose of 10 gray would have caused blistering, ulceration, and tissue necrosis across the body surface. Whether anyone could have survived depends on how quickly they reached whatever radiation shelter was available and on what medical intervention was possible, 250,000 miles from the nearest hospital. Survival would have been uncertain. Solar particle events exist on a spectrum from modest to catastrophic, cannot be predicted, with advance warning of more than an hour or 2 at best, and a round-trip Mars mission of approximately 900 days buys vastly more tickets in that probabilistic lottery than Apollo bought across 3 years of lunar surface operations. Storm shelters, densely shielded volumes within the spacecraft, can reduce solar particle event doses to survivable levels if the crew retreats quickly enough, and the event is not at the extreme end of the severity. Spectrum. But the shelters being designed for near-term Mars missions represent trade-offs between dose reduction and the mass constraints of launch, and no shelter design currently guarantees survival under a worst-case event at an affordable mass budget. But solar particle events, for all their acute drama, are not the radiation hazard that space medicine researchers most consistently identify as their primary concern for long-duration missions. The threat they return to most frequently in the literature is slower, accumulates silently across months, and targets the specific organ that the mission cannot function without. Galactic cosmic rays are a different kind of problem in almost every way that matters. They are not generated by our sun. They originate outside the solar system entirely, produced by the violent deaths of massive stars, supernovae, the implosive collapse of stellar cores, the extreme magnetic environments around neutron stars, events that scatter high-energy particles through the galaxy in all directions at energies so high that no material of practical engineering thickness can stop them entirely. The Earth manages this bombardment through two overlapping shields. The magnetosphere deflects charged particles along field lines, and the atmosphere absorbs what remains, reducing the annual radiation dose at sea level to approximately 2.4 millisieverts from all natural sources combined. The Moon has no global magnetic field. Mars has a minimal remnant one. The space between them has none at all. In 2011 and 2012, NASA's Curiosity rover made the Earth-to-Mars journey carrying a radiation assessment detector, the first direct in-transit measurement of deep space radiation in a crewed vehicle-like environment. The average measured dose rate during the cruise phase was approximately 1.8 millisieverts per day. Across a round-trip Mars mission with approximately 500 days of transit time, that accumulates to roughly 900 millisieverts from transit radiation alone before a single day is spent on the Martian surface. NASA's current career limit for astronaut total radiation exposure is 600 millisieverts. A single Mars round trip exceeds that career limit by 50%. The career limit reflects an acceptable risk of radiation-induced fatal cancer, a risk that operates over years to decades after exposure and is genuinely serious enough to shape the lifelong health of those who accept it. Managing the conflict between mission requirements and the career limit is one of the current policy challenges in Mars mission planning, and the solutions being discussed include waiving the limit for Mars mission volunteers who provide informed consent to the elevated risk. That conversation is real, ongoing, and unresolved in any publicly documented framework. But cancer risk, as terrible as it is, will not impair the crew's judgment at the moment they need to diagnose an engineering failure at 80 million kilometers from home. The threat to consciousness, to the cognitive performance the mission depends on in real time during the mission, comes from a different mechanism, one the public conversation has almost entirely overlooked. At the NASA Space Radiation Laboratory at Brookhaven National Laboratory, researchers have spent the past 2 decades exposing laboratory rodents to simulated galactic cosmic radiation and testing those animals extensively on cognitive tasks. The goal is to understand not the long-term cancer risk, but the immediate neurological effects that what prolonged heavy ion bombardment does to the brain structures that support memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Charles Limmerle's laboratory at the University of California, Irvine has led some of the most widely cited work in this domain, publishing a series of studies whose findings have been independently replicated across multiple research groups using different particle types, different dose levels, and different behavioral testing protocols. Mice exposed to doses of simulated galactic cosmic radiation equivalent to a Mars transit showed significant deficits on multiple cognitive measures. Working memory performance declined compared to unexposed controls. Fear extinction, the cognitive process by which an animal learns that a previously threatening stimulus is no longer dangerous. A function requiring effective communication between the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus was measurably impaired. The ability to flex behavioral responses based on changing environmental contingencies, a measure of cognitive flexibility that relies on executive function systems in the prefrontal cortex, was reduced. Anxiety-like behavior increased across multiple behavioral paradigms, and physical inspection of irradiated brains revealed structural changes that corresponded directly to the behavioral findings. Neurogenesis in the hippocampus, the generation of new neurons in the brain region, most directly responsible for forming and consolidating new memories, was reduced in irradiated animals. The hippocampus is among the most radiation-sensitive structures in the brain, partly because its active neurogenesis depends on dividing cells that are more vulnerable to radiation damage than mature, non-dividing neurons. Reduce hippocampal neurogenesis, and you reduce the brain's capacity to form and retain new information, precisely the capacity needed to learn new procedures, adapt to unexpected situations, and remember critical operational details in a dynamic and dangerous environment. More striking still was the finding of dendritic simplification. Dendrites are the branching extensions of neurons, the tree-like structures that receive signals from other neurons at specialized junctions called synapses. The density and complexity of dendritic branching determines, in part, the richness of the connections available to any given neuron, and therefore the computational power of the circuits those neurons form. Irradiated animals showed measurable reductions in dendritic branching complexity in neurons of the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, a simplification of the physical architecture of information processing in exactly the brain. Regions most relevant to the executive functions and memory capacity that a Mars mission depends on, the neurons were not simply firing less efficiently, they had fewer connections. The physical infrastructure of their communication network had been materially reduced. The mechanism by which galactic cosmic ray heavy ions produce these cognitive effects is increasingly well understood at the cellular level. High-energy heavy ions, the most biologically damaging component of the galactic cosmic ray spectrum, are distinguished from lower-energy radiation types by their high linear energy transfer, meaning they deposit dense tracts of energy along their path through tissue, rather than spreading the dose more diffusely. Where a low-energy photon might ionize molecules sporadically along its path, a heavy ion nucleus, traveling near the speed of light, leaves a dense column of ionization through every cell it passes through, disrupting DNA, damaging mitochondria, altering membrane chemistry, and triggering inflammatory cascades in surrounding tissue. In actively dividing cells, like the neural progenitor cells in the hippocampus that support neurogenesis, this damage can kill the cell outright or cause mutations that remove it from the dividing pool. In mature postmitotic neurons, like the prefrontal cortical neurons involved in working memory and executive function, it cannot kill the cell through the same mechanism, but it disrupts the cellular machinery that maintains synaptic connections, reducing the expression of proteins needed for dendritic branching and synaptic plasticity. The result at the systems level is the dendritic simplification and reduced neurogenesis documented in the laboratory findings. One partial bridge between these animal findings and human populations comes from clinical experience with high-energy particle radiation therapy. Patients who have received proton therapy or carbon ion therapy for brain tumors treatment modalities using particle beams at energies somewhat comparable to galactic cosmic rays show cognitive outcomes in long-term follow-up that are consistent with the animal findings, including impairments in memory, processing speed, and executive function. These populations differ from Mars astronauts in important ways. They are often ill, often older, and receiving radiation in focused doses to specific brain regions rather than whole-brain chronic exposure. The comparison is imperfect, but it establishes that high-energy particle radiation reaching brain tissue produces persistent cognitive consequences in actual human beings, which is more than the animal-only database alone could claim. The honest scientist's first objection to any public communication of this research is that mice are not humans, their brains are organized differently, and their radiation sensitivity may differ in ways that complicate extrapolation. Every researcher who has published in this area acknowledges these limitations explicitly. But the consistency of findings across multiple independent laboratories, multiple particle types, and multiple dose levels has been sufficient to move NASA from treating galactic cosmic ray neurotoxicity as a theoretical concern to treating it as a priority research question requiring active investigation. That institutional judgment by an agency not given to alarmism about its own programs is itself informative. And here is what makes this hazard distinctly dangerous for a crewed mission. The cognitive effects, if they occur in humans at transit doses, would almost certainly be subtle, not dramatic, not obvious. Not the kind of impairment that announces itself through slurred speech or sudden inability to perform familiar tasks. Working memory slightly reduced, processing speed slightly slower, cognitive flexibility slightly diminished, fear extinction slightly impaired, meaning, in human terms, a slightly reduced ability to suppress fear responses to stimuli that are rationally recognizable as non-threatening, which, in a confined, high-stakes spacecraft would translate to slightly elevated baseline anxiety, slightly reduced emotional regulation, slightly increased stress reactivity. Each deficit in isolation sits within the range of normal daily variation. What galactic cosmic radiation appears to do is shift the entire distribution of daily performance downward, not by enough to be obvious in casual observation, but by enough to matter in the execution of complex cognitive tasks under time pressure and stress. And it shifts that distribution in people who are already, by month 15 of a Mars transit, sleep-deprived, socially stressed, and operating in conditions that impose their own cognitive burdens entirely independent of radiation. The compounding is the problem. Any one of these stressors in isolation produces effects that a resilient, selected human being can manage, together, over 20 months, in an environment that provides no relief from any of them. They form a cumulative burden that the available data consistently suggests will produce measurable cognitive impairment in the people the mission most depends on, and whose self-assessment of their own impairment is itself degraded by the same conditions. The shielding problem compounds the biological one in ways that are both technically and institutionally frustrating, because the solution that intuition suggests put more shielding between the crew and the radiation is the solution that physics limits most severely. Unlike solar particle events, against which a storm shelter with adequate mass provides meaningful dose reduction, galactic cosmic rays are energetic enough that adding shielding material produces diminishing returns that eventually turn negative. When high-energy heavy ions collide with dense shielding material, the collision produces secondary particles, neutrons, gamma rays, lighter charged fragments that scatter through the material and into the tissue behind it. At intermediate shielding thicknesses, this secondary particle production can add dose rather than subtracting it. There is an optimal shielding thickness beyond which adding more mass increases the dose, and for a Mars transit vehicle, reaching even the optimal thickness competes directly with every other mass requirement. Active magnetic shielding, using a superconducting coil system to generate a deflecting field around the spacecraft, has been studied since the 1960s and remains technically unsolved at the scale and mass budget that a crewed vehicle would allow. Pharmacological countermeasures that reduce radiation-induced cognitive change in animal models have been identified in laboratory settings. None has been validated for human use in space conditions at the doses and durations a Mars mission would require. A crew departing for Mars in the near term will absorb the dose that the transit delivers, with whatever partial mitigation the vehicle's passive shielding can provide, into a brain whose neurons respond to that radiation in ways that laboratory research consistently suggests are cognitively consequential. There is a more immediate, faster-acting, and in some ways more alarming cognitive threat in deep space, one that reveals itself not over months of radiation exposure, but within the first few weeks of any long-duration mission, and that has already produced, documented, measured consequences in astronauts who spent standard 6-month tours aboard the International Space Station. Within the first days of a microgravity mission, approximately 2 liters of fluid shift from the lower body toward the upper body and head, raising the pressure of the fluid surrounding and filling the brain. On Earth, gravity draws a portion of this fluid downward at all times, and the cardiovascular system actively maintains the fluid balance between the body's compartments. In microgravity, that downward pull disappears, and the fluid accumulates around the brain in volumes and pressures the skull was not designed to accommodate indefinitely. The clinical syndrome the elevated pressure produces has a formal name: spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, abbreviated SANS, that was not formally established until 2011, when NASA flight surgeons reviewing returning astronauts recognized a pattern of findings they had previously noted individually without connecting. Flattening of the posterior globe, a change in the shape of the eyeball at the back, where the optic nerve connects, swelling of the optic nerve head, folds in the tissue behind the retina, and most strikingly, some astronauts were returning from 6-month missions with measurably impaired near vision, requiring reading glasses for tasks they had performed without optical correction before flight. The reason is that the optic nerve is not merely a wire connecting the eye to the brain, it is a direct extension of brain tissue itself, surrounded by a sheath of cerebrospinal fluid in communication with the fluid inside the skull. When intracranial pressure elevates, the pressure is transmitted along the optic nerve's fluid sheath to the point where the nerve exits the eye, producing swelling of the optic nerve head that ophthalmologists and neurologists on Earth associate with dangerous intracranial conditions, brain tumors, dangerous fluid accumulations, conditions that in a terrestrial patient would prompt urgent investigation. By 2020, a comprehensive review of NASA astronaut data found SANS findings in approximately 70% of those who had flown long-duration missions, not an anomaly, not an unusual subset. More than 2/3 of every person who spent 6 months or more in microgravity showed measurable changes to their visual system. SANS matters for the consciousness discussion, not primarily because impaired vision creates operational problems, though it obviously does. An astronaut who cannot read instrument panels at normal working distance is a liability in any time-pressured emergency. SANS matters because its underlying cause is elevated intracranial pressure, and elevated intracranial pressure does not only affect the optic nerves, it affects the brain directly. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2019 examined brain MRI scans obtained before and after long-duration spaceflight from a sample of NASA astronauts. Long-duration flyers showed measurable increases in the volume of cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain, narrowing of the spaces between the top of the brain and the inner surface of the skull, consistent with upward compression from redistributed fluid, and upward displacement of the brain within the skull, a finding that in any terrestrial patient would prompt urgent investigation. A significant number of these changes were still present at imaging conducted 12 months after the astronauts returned to Earth. The brain had not fully returned to its pre-flight configuration at the 1-year mark. Individual susceptibility to SANS varies substantially and is not currently predictable before flight. Some astronauts develop pronounced optic nerve changes and measurable visual impairment after a single long mission. Others complete multiple long-duration tours with minimal findings. Understanding why some brains are more vulnerable than others, whether the variation reflects anatomical differences, in cerebrospinal fluid drainage pathways, differences in baseline intracranial pressure regulation, or genetic factors is an active research question without settled answers. Predicting before a mission which crew members are most at risk and therefore most in need of protective countermeasures would allow targeted prevention rather than applying the same protocol uniformly to all crew, regardless of individual risk profile. That predictive capability does not currently exist. The cognitive consequences of SANS beyond the visual system are real, but remain an area of active investigation rather than settled consensus. Persistently elevated intracranial pressure in terrestrial patients from any cause, whether tumor, hydrocephalus, or idiopathic intracranial hypertension, is associated with cognitive symptoms including headache, visual disturbance, concentration difficulties, and in severe or prolonged cases, measurable cognitive decline on neuropsychological testing. The brain changes documented on MRI in returning, long-duration astronauts, the expanded fluid spaces, the tissue displacement. The microstructural alterations are consistent with the effects of chronic, mild to moderate intracranial pressure elevation. Whether the magnitude of elevation that spaceflight produces is sufficient to cause functionally significant cognitive impairment is the key question that the current data cannot definitively answer, because measuring intracranial pressure directly requires invasive monitoring that is not routinely performed in astronauts. The non-invasive proxies, the MRI changes, the optic nerve changes, the visual acuity impairment, provide strong circumstantial evidence of elevated pressure without quantifying how elevated. That gap between the evidence for elevated pressure and the evidence for its cognitive consequences is one of the most clinically significant unknowns in current space medicine research. For a Mars mission, the duration of elevated intracranial pressure would extend well beyond anything systematically studied in actual astronauts. The longest long-duration ISS missions lasted approximately 1 year. A Mars mission would expose the crew to microgravity-induced fluid shift for at least 8 months of outbound transit. A surface period in Mars's 0.38 gravity, unlikely to fully restore normal fluid distribution, and then another 8 or more months of return transit. The brain MRI findings from 1-year missions represent the lower bound of what the data would predict for a Mars mission. The upper bound is unknown because no human being has been in microgravity for that duration. The most effective countermeasure for cephalad fluid shift is restoring normal gravitational loading, which happens automatically on Earth every morning and does not happen in a spacecraft without a rotating section. Lower body negative pressure devices that draw fluid back toward the legs have shown promise in ISS testing. Regular sessions measurably reduce the severity of optic nerve changes and the fluid distribution imbalance that drives them. But lower body negative pressure is a countermeasure, not a solution. It reduces the problem for the duration of the session without preventing the underlying shift from occurring throughout the rest of the day. Artificial gravity through spacecraft rotation would address the mechanism directly, preventing the cephalad fluid shift from occurring rather than partially counteracting its consequences for 30 minutes a day. No crewed deep space vehicle currently being designed incorporates it. The engineering complexity and mass penalty are real, but so is the multi-year accumulation of intracranial pressure and brain structural change that its absence produces. And the comparison between those two costs has not been worked through rigorously in any publicly available mission planning document. In 1973, the crew of Skylab 4 did something that had never happened before in the history of human spaceflight and has never happened since. They turned off the radio. Not because of a technical malfunction, because they were exhausted, overworked, behind schedule on a task list that had never been designed to be achievable by human beings in their actual physiological condition. Gerald Carr, William Pogue, and Edward Gibson had been scheduled at maximum capacity from their first day in orbit, without the adaptation time that previous Skylab crews had received before their workloads ramped up. For 1 day, they did not respond to communications from Houston. They rested, They looked at the Earth. They talked to each other about what was happening and what they needed. When contact resumed, they negotiated directly for a more sustainable work schedule, one that accounted for the actual physiological state of the people doing the work, rather than an idealized version of what trained astronauts ought, theoretically, to be capable of. The negotiation succeeded, the mission completed, all three returned safely, the science was accomplished. History has sometimes described this as a mutiny, a word that carries overtones of insubordination that fit neither the people nor the situation. Their response, direct communication of physiological reality, collective negotiation for conditions compatible with sustainable performance, was, clinically, the healthy choice. Continuing to push through deteriorating performance while declining to communicate the deterioration would have been the dangerous one. But the incident revealed something that still matters 50 years later. The gap between what institutional planners expect from human performance in space and what human performance can actually sustain is not theoretical. It is real, it has a tipping point, and the consequences of hitting it 400 kilometers above Earth, with continuous communication available and an emergency return option requiring hours, are very different from the consequences of hitting it at 80 million kilometers from home, where there is no real-time communication and no return option at all. The communication delay is not simply a technical inconvenience of deep space. It restructures the entire relationship between crew and ground that every previous crewed spaceflight has depended on, and it does so completely. Currently, communication between the International Space Station and the ground travels at the speed of light across approximately 400 kilometers, arriving in a quarter of a second. The delay is imperceptible. An astronaut reports a symptom. The flight surgeon responds within minutes. An engineering anomaly appears. Specialist teams are assembled and diagnose it within hours. The ground is present, not just monitoring passively, but actively participating in the cognitive and operational management of the mission at every moment. Every decision of consequence can be escalated. Every uncertainty can be resolved in real time. The crew is never truly alone with a problem. Earth and Mars are separated by distances that make this presence physically impossible. At closest orbital approach, the distance is approximately 54 million kilometers. A radio signal takes roughly 3 minutes to cross that distance, 6 minutes for a single round-trip exchange. At average orbital separations during a mission, the one-way delay is 12 to 24 minutes. At maximum separation, when Earth and Mars sit on opposite sides of the Sun in their respective orbits, the delay approaches 45 minutes one way, a 90-minute round trip for a single question and answer. Every operational practice that mission control has developed across 60-plus years of human spaceflight becomes obsolete. Real-time intervention when an astronaut makes a critical error, impossible. Immediate physician response to a reported symptom, impossible. Rapid escalation of an unexpected engineering problem to a specialist team who can diagnose it within the hour, impossible. The psychological support conversation with the flight surgeon the crew trusts, impossible in any form that resembles the conversations possible aboard the station. Every framework of crisis management in modern spaceflight assumes ground-based real-time capability. That assumption dissolves completely past a few light minutes. Several times during a Mars mission, the delay does not merely impose latency, it eliminates communication entirely. During solar conjunction, when the Sun passes between Earth and Mars, the Sun's electromagnetic emissions overwhelm any radio signal trying to pass through the region of space near the solar disk. Communication blackouts during solar conjunction can last several weeks. The crew receives nothing from Earth, no messages, no telemetry acknowledgements, no medical consultations, no family communications, no voice from home of any kind. They are alone in a way that no human crew in the history of spaceflight has experienced, not temporarily, as in a radio shadow on early missions, but completely, for weeks, at a point in the mission when the accumulated stresses of months in space are at or near their peak. What this communication structure demands is not just operational adaptation, but a fundamental redesign of the institutional support architecture that every previous crewed spaceflight has depended on. The redesign is not incremental, it is categorical. Every support system that exists in current spaceflight was designed around the assumption of real-time communication with the ground. Removing that assumption does not leave those systems functioning at reduced effectiveness. It renders them inoperable in their current form. A flight surgeon protocol that assumes a physician can review telemetry and respond within minutes is not a protocol that works with a 30-minute latency. It is a different kind of protocol entirely. One in which the physician's role shifts from real-time responder to asynchronous consultant, and the crew's role shifts from execution of physician guidance to autonomous medical decision-making with delayed expert input. That shift requires not just different procedures, but different training, different decision-making frameworks, different documentation systems, and a different relationship between the crew and their own clinical judgment. Building those different systems and validating them adequately before the first crew needs them in a real emergency is the kind of institutional challenge that gets less attention than rocket propulsion and heat shield design, and that matters at least as much for mission success. The flight surgeon model, in which a physician monitors crew health in real time and provides guidance within minutes of any reported concern, must be replaced by a model in which medical care is substantially autonomous and consultation is asynchronous text exchange. The mission control model, in which specialist teams can be assembled and consulted within hours of an anomaly, must be replaced by a model in which the crew diagnoses and resolves problems from onboard documentation and their own expertise, without the option of escalating, except in slow-moving situations. The psychological support model, in which behavioral health professionals maintain ongoing relationships with the crew and intervene early when patterns of concern emerge, must function through message exchanges with latencies that preclude any response in the moment of acute need. Designing these replacement systems is one of the most active areas of human spaceflight research right now, and one of the least visible in public discussion of Mars mission preparation. The behavioral research examining what happens to people under prolonged isolation and confinement has been accumulating for decades, from Antarctic winter-over studies, submarine deployment research, and long-duration analog simulations. The most consistent finding across all of these research contexts is one that has been named the third quarter phenomenon, and its consistency across independent programs, different cultures, different professional backgrounds, and different mission durations suggests it reflects something fundamental about human psychology under prolonged isolation. The pattern works as follows. In the first quarter of a long, isolated mission, novelty provides motivational energy. The group adapts, explores, forms cohesion. New procedures are being learned, new relationships forming, and the environment, however demanding, is still the subject of active discovery. In the second quarter, routines establish and the team achieves genuine productivity. The midpoint of the mission often carries a brief motivational lift, as the narrative symmetry of being half done provides a psychological landmark. In the fourth quarter, the approaching end provides the motivational anchor of a visible finish line. But in the third quarter, after the novelty has fully dissipated, after the halfway mark has passed, with still a long way to go, something shifts. Morale drops. Irritability increases, measurably in observer ratings, and sometimes dramatically in documented conflicts. Sleep worsens. Emotional withdrawal increases. People who were cooperative begin to separate into subgroups, to ruminate on grievances, to interpret ambiguous communications from others more negatively than a rested or less isolated person would. The psychological budget required to maintain productive interpersonal relationships under chronic stress has been depleted, and nothing in the third quarter automatically replenishes it. The Mars, 500 isolation study conducted by the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow between 2010 and 2011 provided the most detailed and longest duration human analog data on Mars mission psychology ever collected. 6 male volunteers, 3 Russian, 2 European, 1 Chinese, spent 520 days sealed inside a simulated Mars spacecraft at a Moscow research facility, conducting simulated mission activities, managing simulated emergencies, and communicating with a simulated ground team through engineered time delays. The facility had no windows to the outside world. Physical health remained largely intact, but sedentary behavior increased dramatically as the mission progressed more than 5 additional hours per day above baseline by the midpoint, reflecting a withdrawal of engagement that behavioral health researchers associate with depression and motivational decline. Sleep patterns shifted and deteriorated. 2 crew members showed clinically significant depressive symptomatology by validated measurement instruments. 1 developed a sleep disorder serious enough to be documented as a medical finding. The third quarter phenomenon appeared on schedule, with morale and interpersonal cohesion data showing the predicted deterioration in the mission's second half. These findings came from a highly selected, motivated group of volunteers who knew that opening a door would end the study at any time. The psychological safety net of a real, accessible exit, never formally acknowledged but always physically present, cannot be ruled out as a meaningful moderator. The question of what these same dynamics would produce in a crew that genuinely could not leave, that had committed to a transit from which there was no turning back after the first few weeks, remains empirically unanswered. The crew dynamics problem embedded in the third quarter phenomenon has a specific feature that makes it harder to manage than the research summary implies. The interpersonal conflicts that the third quarter produces do not arrive with clear causal labels attached. They do not present as, "This is the third quarter phenomenon and it will pass." They present as real grievances between real people, rooted in behaviors that are genuinely occurring and genuinely frustrating, interpreted through the lens of months of accumulated fatigue, social stress, and sleep deprivation that colors every perception more negatively than it would be colored by a rested, well-supported person in a less extreme environment. The crew member who has become withdrawn and irritable is not performing third quarter syndrome. They are experiencing genuine psychological difficulty in a genuinely difficult environment, and the other crew members are experiencing genuine frustration with the genuine effects of that difficulty on the team's function. The knowledge that such dynamics were predicted before launch, that there are protocols for managing them, that the feelings are likely to shift in the fourth quarter, all of this is intellectually available to a crew that has been well prepared. But intellectual knowledge and emotional experience are not the same thing, and the prefrontal cortex that would normally translate the intellectual knowledge into effective behavioral regulation is itself impaired by the same conditions that are driving the conflict. A Mars mission of approximately 900 days, total 250 days outbound, 400 on the surface, 250 returning, would hit its psychological third quarter at roughly day 450 during the surface operations phase. That phase is when the crew conducts the most complex and highest consequence activities of the entire mission: EVAs on the Martian surface, scientific sample collection, habitat maintenance, rover operations, all the experiments and constructions the mission was designed to achieve. The third quarter degradation in morale, interpersonal cohesion, cognitive engagement, and emotional regulation would arrive precisely when the mission most requires their opposite. Sleep is not optional maintenance for the human nervous system. It is mandatory neurological housekeeping, without which the brain's higher functions degrade on a predictable timetable that no amount of professional training, personal discipline, or organizational motivation can override. The biology of this is precise. During waking hours, neuronal activity throughout the brain produces adenosine as a byproduct, a molecular signal that accumulates in synaptic spaces and progressively suppresses the firing of wake-promoting neurons in the brainstem. Hypothalamus, creating increasing pressure to sleep. The longer waking continues, the more adenosine accumulates, and the more profoundly the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive function, working memory, impulse control, and the integration of complex information across multiple domains, is suppressed. These are precisely the cognitive functions most critical to mission performance in any complex emergency. After 17 consecutive hours without sleep, cognitive performance on standardized tests of reaction time, working memory, and sustained attention is equivalent to a blood alcohol concentration of approximately 0.05%. After 24 hours awake, the equivalence reaches approximately 0.1%, above the legal driving limit in every jurisdiction in the world. This is not a loose analogy. It is a finding from controlled laboratory studies in which participants were tested at regular intervals during sleep deprivation and compared to performance at known blood alcohol levels. The impairment is pharmacological and involuntary, and critically, sleep-deprived people consistently overestimate their own cognitive performance, rating themselves as less impaired than objective tests demonstrate them to be. The metacognitive capacity to assess one's own cognitive function is itself degraded by the same conditions that degrade the cognitive functions it is trying to assess. A crew member who has been accumulating sleep debt for 12 months may be the last person in the spacecraft to recognize that their judgment has become unreliable, which is precisely the situation most dangerous to act upon. Space is not a good environment for sleep, and it is worth being specific about why, because the mechanisms matter for how countermeasures are designed and evaluated. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station average approximately 6 hours of sleep per night, compared to the 7 to 9 hours recommended for cognitive health in healthy adults on Earth. Sleep efficiency, the fraction of time in bed that consists of actual sleep rather than lying awake, drops from a normal Earth value of roughly 88% to approximately 74% on station. The distribution of sleep stages changes, with reduced slow-wave deep sleep and reduced REM sleep, the stages most associated with memory consolidation, emotional processing, and restoration of prefrontal cortex function. A person sleeping 6 hours instead of 8 hours every night for 180 days accumulates a sleep debt of 360 hours across a standard ISS mission, the equivalent of 15 full days of missed sleep, distributed in daily 2-hour increments. That debt impairs cognition progressively throughout its accumulation, most severely in working memory, emotional regulation, and sustained attention. The fact that astronauts take prescribed sleep medication at a rate approximately 26 times higher during flight than in the months immediately before launch documents this gap in a way that subjective reports might not fully capture. The people accepting sleeping pills at 26 times their baseline rate are the most psychologically selected, most professionally motivated individuals available, with every career-based reason to minimize health concerns. The gap between terrestrial sleep quality and space sleep quality is real, large, and resistant to individual willpower. Sleeping medications are not cognitively transparent, which adds a further layer of complexity to the pharmacological management of sleep in space. Depending on the class of medication, they can produce residual sedation the following day, reduce the quality of slow-wave sleep, even when they increase total sleep duration, impair the memory consolidation that normally occurs during sleep, and interact with other medications in ways that affect next-day cognitive performance. Managing the sleep medication trade-off across a 20-month mission, balancing the cognitive cost of insufficient sleep against the cognitive cost of the medication needed to address it. In a crew whose cognitive performance the mission depends on and whose consultation with a physician is asynchronous, is a medical challenge for which available clinical guidance comes almost entirely from Earth populations in Earth conditions. The specific sleep pharmacology of a 20-month Mars transit has never been studied because the 20-month Mars transit has never occurred. The first crew will manage it with protocols extrapolated from shorter missions and terrestrial clinical practice, which is the best available foundation and an incomplete one. The sleep problem in space has multiple independent contributing causes that would each be challenging alone. The circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that synchronizes physiology to Earth's 2-4-hour day-night cycle, relies primarily on light as its synchronizing signal. In low Earth orbit, the station passes through 16 sunrises and sunsets in every 24 hours. The circadian system cannot entrain to a 9-0-minute cycle. In deep space transit, constant darkness is the environment, providing no natural circadian signal at all. The crew relies entirely on artificial lighting schedules and behavioral discipline to maintain any approximation of a 2-4-hour rhythm, and neither is fully effective across a 20-month mission. The result is chronic circadian misalignment, a persistent state in which the body clock and the sleep-wake schedule are out of phase, producing the same cognitive impairment that shift workers on Earth experience, but without the relief of returning to a normal schedule on days off. The carbon dioxide concentration inside a sealed spacecraft adds a layer that rarely appears in popular discussion. The International Space Station routinely operates at CO2 concentrations of 0.5 to 0.7%, more than 10 times the outdoor Earth concentration of 0.04%. A study published in Environmental Health Perspectives found that cognitive performance on complex decision-making tasks declined significantly at CO2 levels of 1% levels that have been documented aboard the Pend station compared to clean air conditions. For a Mars transit vehicle with a fixed life support capacity and a sealed atmosphere, CO2 concentrations will depend on the efficiency of the scrubbing system and the operational maintenance burden it imposes on a crew whose time is constrained. The crew of a Mars mission will likely spend 20 months breathing air that measurably impairs their cognition, on top of every other cognitive burden the mission simultaneously imposes. The interaction between sleep deprivation, elevated CO2, radiation exposure, and the psychological stresses of long-duration confinement does not sum arithmetically. These stressors interact in feedback loops that amplify each other. Sleep deprivation increases emotional reactivity, the intensity and negativity of responses to ambiguous or mildly aversive stimuli. In a confined environment with no option to step away, that means crewmates' neutral or mildly frustrating behaviors are interpreted more negatively than a rested person would interpret them. More negative interpretations produce more interpersonal friction. Friction generates social stress. Social stress degrades sleep quality. Degraded sleep amplifies emotional reactivity. The cycle does not self-correct. Without active and sustained behavioral intervention, it tightens. The immune system changes in space add another layer to this picture that is easy to overlook. Spaceflight produces documented alterations in immune function, reduced natural killer cell activity, changes in T-cell responses, shifts in cytokine profiles, and reactivation of latent herpes viruses including Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, and varicella zoster virus that are normally kept dormant by immune surveillance. These immune changes have been documented in astronauts both during and after long-duration missions. The connection to cognitive function operates through the neuroimmune axis, the bidirectional communication network between the immune system and the central nervous system, which means that immune activation and the inflammatory cytokines it releases can directly affect brain function, contributing to fatigue, cognitive slowing, reduced motivation, and mood disturbance in ways that compound the effects of sleep deprivation and radiation exposure. The crew of a Mars mission will not be managing sleep impairment, radiation effects, isolation psychology, and immune dysregulation as separate problems. They will be managing them as a single integrated physiological state, because that is how the human body experiences them. The individual who most needs better sleep at month 16 of the mission is the same individual who most lacks the insight to recognize that their sleep is degraded, whose emotional reactivity makes intervention by colleagues difficult, and whose cognitive performance the mission most depends on at exactly that moment. The interaction of sleep deprivation with the other cognitive stressors of deep space has a clinical name in the sleep medicine literature: cumulative sleep debt, and the research on how it accumulates and impairs is extensive, enough to provide quantitative predictions that mission planners can use. A person sleeping 6 hours instead of 8 every night for 20 months accumulates a theoretical sleep debt equivalent to 122 full days of missed sleep. Sleep debt at that scale is not simply recovered by catching up on weekends. Chronic partial sleep deprivation produces persistent deficits in cognitive performance that do not fully resolve even with extended recovery sleep, because the neurobiological processes that maintain synaptic strength and consolidate memories require the full architecture of adequate nightly sleep to function optimally. A crew that has been sleeping 6 hours a night for 15 months is not simply tired. They are operating with a cognitive deficit that has been baked into their neurophysiology across hundreds of nights, that affects the same prefrontal cortical systems, that radiation exposure and fluid shift are simultaneously stressing, and that will not resolve without interventions more targeted than try to get more sleep. This is a design requirement, not a counsel of despair. Missions that acknowledge these realities in their architecture, that build in sleep countermeasures, circadian lighting systems, behavioral health support, and workload management practices that account for the impairment the crew will experience rather than assuming it away, are more likely to succeed than missions that trust the selected resilience to sustain performance that no amount of resilience can sustain indefinitely across a 20-month arc. The medical problem in deep space concentrates every other challenge in this account into its sharpest form. It is the problem of the no evacuation constraint. Every medical system ever built by every civilization in human history is organized around a single foundational principle. When a patient's condition exceeds the capability available where they are, move them to a higher level of care. You stabilize at the scene and transport. You manage on the ward and transfer to intensive care when the clinical picture worsens. You treat at the regional hospital and refer to the academic medical center when specialist expertise is required. The logic is hierarchical, and the hierarchy is always accessible through transportation. A Mars crew has one level of care. Whatever medical capability is present aboard the spacecraft or on the planet's surface is the entire medical system that exists for any medical event that occurs. There is no emergency department to call. There is no hospital to transport to. There is no specialist to fly in. There is no second physician to provide a consulting opinion in real time when the diagnosis is uncertain and the margin for error is small. Dental emergencies occur at a rate, making it essentially certain that at least one crew member will experience a significant dental event during a Mars mission. An acute abscess, managed without a dentist, using supplies from a general medical kit by a crew member with dental emergency training, is demanding but achievable with adequate preparation. Cardiac events represent a more serious risk, not because healthy young astronauts have high baseline cardiac risk, but because the cardiovascular changes produced by long-duration spaceflight alter the heart and vasculature in ways that could interact unfavorably with any underlying vulnerability that pre-flight screening did not detect. A myocardial infarction on a Mars mission would require diagnosis by a non-cardiologist, treatment using a limited drug formulary, and ongoing management with no means of evacuation to a catheterization laboratory. The outcome would depend on what thrombolytics the mission medical kit carried, the training of the crew member administering them, and the physiological response of a patient whose cardiovascular system has already been altered by months in microgravity. Surgical emergencies represent the extreme end of the medical risk spectrum. An acute appendicitis, a perforated bowel, a traumatic injury from a surface EVA, any condition requiring surgical intervention poses a challenge that honest assessment must describe as potentially unsurvivable in the most adverse circumstances. Laparoscopic surgery in microgravity has been studied in ground-based analogues and shown to be technically feasible, and one crew member will have received surgical training as part of mission preparation. But surgical outcomes depend not just on technique but on anesthesia management, sterile field maintenance, post-operative care, and the availability of blood products and broad-spectrum antibiotics, all constrained by what the mass budget can carry and what a small crew already conducting other mission-critical activities can manage. Simultaneously, the psychiatric medical problem develops differently from the physical ones, not with the acute clarity of an appendicitis, but insidiously, through behavioral changes that are visible to people who know the affected person well, who are themselves under the same stressors, who have their own reasons to minimize what they observe, and who have no mechanism for consulting a psychiatrist in real time. NASA's Human Research Program classifies behavioral conditions as one of the top risks to mission success, encompassing subclinical conditions that impair performance without constituting a formal diagnosis, frank psychiatric disorders including depression and anxiety disorders, and interpersonal conflict that compromises crew cohesion and mission safety. The ISS record includes documented cases of anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, and interpersonal conflict in long-duration crew, all managed with real-time ground support from behavioral health professionals who knew the crew and could provide immediate, tailored guidance. For a Mars crew in the same situation, support is asynchronous text exchange, arriving 12 to 45 minutes after the message was sent, from a professional who has not seen the affected individual for months and whose assessment depends on the self-report of someone who may lack insight into their own condition. The crew selection process is the primary risk mitigation for behavioral conditions, and it is genuinely effective. The psychological screening applied to long-duration mission candidates is among the most thorough in any professional context. But selection reduces probability without eliminating risk, and the very thoroughness of the selection means that the entire evidence base for understanding human behavioral health in deep space comes from people selected against the problems most likely to occur. We know what happens to the most psychologically resilient humans in space. The data for how people closer to the center of the resilience distribution would fare simply does not exist, because those people do not get selected. The absence of real-time medical consultation creates a specific kind of clinical challenge that has no good terrestrial parallel. In Earth medicine, clinical decision-making in uncertain situations is supported by the ability to consult colleagues, to order additional tests and receive results quickly, to admit a patient for observation while the clinical picture clarifies, and to escalate rapidly if the situation worsens unexpectedly. All of these options depend on proximity to colleagues, to diagnostic equipment, to higher-level care. A Mars crew physician making a diagnostic decision about a crew member's worsening abdominal pain at month 14 of the mission has none of these options available in real time. They have their training, their onboard diagnostic equipment, their medical kit, and the knowledge that any consultation with Earth will return a response 30 minutes to 90 minutes after the concern is communicated. They will make the decision before the reply arrives, and they will make it with a prefrontal cortex that has been subject to the same sleep deprivation, radiation exposure, and psychological stressors as every other crew member. In a clinical context, the acute medical emergency that demands the precise cognitive functions most impaired by those conditions. The no evacuation constraint changes the design philosophy of everything. A crew in low Earth orbit can be brought home within hours if a medical or psychiatric emergency develops beyond the mission's management capacity. A Mars crew cannot. There is no mechanism for removing a crew member who has become a danger to themselves or others from the spacecraft. Every contingency must be managed within the vehicle and on the surface by the crew, with the medical and psychological resources available on board. A mission can fail and be abandoned. A Mars crew that cannot manage a medical emergency with what they have on board faces consequences that a base crew near Earth does not. That difference alone separates deep space medicine from every medical model human civilization has previously developed. The overview effect is real. It is documented across the accounts of hundreds of astronauts and cosmonauts from dozens of nations spanning 6 decades. And it is consistent enough in its core features to constitute a legitimate area of psychological investigation, rather than simply anecdotal curiosity. When Frank White interviewed astronauts and cosmonauts for his 1987 book, the accounts he collected shared a core feature that transcended individual personalities and cultural backgrounds: a sudden, sometimes overwhelming shift in perceptual perspective, produced by seeing the Earth as a whole, finite, alone, and fragile against the blackness of space. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon on Apollo 14 inches 1971, described an experience of sudden, undeniable interconnection from lunar distance, and the sense that the universe was organized and conscious, and that he was part of it in a way his previous frame of reference had not allowed him to perceive. He returned to Earth changed in ways he described as permanent, and spent the remainder of his career investigating the relationship between consciousness and cosmology through the Institute of Noetic Sciences he founded. Ron Garan, who spent 178 days on the International Space Station, described the paradox of the orbital perspective, the overwhelming beauty of the thin blue line of atmosphere against the blackness, and the simultaneous awareness that this gossamer film was the only barrier between everything he had ever known and the void beyond it. These accounts appear across mission types, national programs, professional backgrounds, and personality types with a consistency that places them beyond anecdote. A 2020 study published in Psychological Science found that photographs taken from space produced measurable increases on validated scales of self-transcendence in research participants, compared to controls shown terrestrial. Photographs. The visual experience of seeing the Earth as a small, isolated sphere against an infinite background produces a genuine, measurable psychological response, detectable through established measurement instruments. The overview effect is scientific fact, not astronaut mythology, and it is among the most compelling facts about human consciousness in space. The overview effect also raises an interesting question about what the psychological experience of deep space beyond Earth orbit, beyond the range from which the Earth is recognizable as a whole disk, would look like. Every documented account of the overview effect comes from crews operating in low Earth orbit or, in the case of Apollo, from crews close enough to the moon that they could still see the Earth clearly. The effect is specifically associated with the visual experience of seeing the Earth as a whole, finite, and fragile object against the blackness of space. A Mars mission crew, for the bulk of their transit, would not see the Earth that way. In the first days after leaving Earth orbit, the planet would still be visually identifiable. Within weeks, it would have shrunk to a bright star, among other bright stars distinguishable from other stars by its apparent motion and its brightness, but no longer a globe, no longer visually evocative of the whole Earth perspective that the overview effect depends on. What the psychological experience of looking toward an Earth that is simply a bright point of light, at a distance so great that no perspective shift is possible, would produce, whether it would be a different version of the overview effect, or its opposite, or something that has no prior description in the literature, is unknown, because no human being has ever been far enough from Earth to experience it. And here is what must be said clearly about it in this context. The overview effect does not mitigate the cognitive consequences of galactic cosmic radiation. Profound experiences of interconnection do not restore hippocampal neurogenesis in neurons damaged by heavy ion bombardment. The transformative perspective shift that accompanies seeing Earth from space does not lower intracranial pressure, improve sleep architecture, prevent the third-quarter deterioration in interpersonal cohesion, make the CO2 concentration lower, the communication delay shorter, or the medical response capability greater. The danger of the overview effect in public discourse is not that it is false. It is that it is so compelling it crowds out the harder conversation. We hear astronauts describe transformed perspectives and expanded consciousness, and we conclude that consciousness in space is expanded rather than constrained. We see the best moment of the spaceflight experience and assume it represents the average. The transformation is real. The cognitive impairment measured on return is equally real. The consciousness that feels expanded by seeing Earth from space is the same consciousness accumulating galactic cosmic radiation dose to its hippocampal neurons throughout the journey. The person who returns from orbit describing a shift in how they understand their relationship to the universe is the same person whose MRI shows persistent brain structural changes at the 12-month follow-up. Both things are true simultaneously. Holding both realities is uncomfortable. It requires giving up the satisfying narrative simplicity of either the transcendence story or the doom story, both of which are more emotionally coherent than the actual data. The actual data is messier, more qualified, and more demanding of nuanced response than either narrative allows. And the nuanced response designing missions that take seriously both the extraordinary human capacity that spaceflight reveals and the extraordinary human vulnerability that spaceflight exposes is the only response that is both honest and useful. The overview effect also points towards something important about what the space environment asks of the human mind that is different from what it takes away. The cognitive impairments documented in this account are, in a specific sense, the costs of exposure to an environment that the human nervous system was not designed for. The overview effect is the benefit the experience of a perspective that the human nervous system was not designed for either, that produces a shift in understanding and compassion that many who have experienced it describe as permanently valuable. Both the cost and the benefit arise from the same source: the radical novelty of the space environment, the experience of conditions and perspectives that no evolutionary history prepared the human mind to encounter. The consciousness problem in deep space is not simply about protecting the brain from damage. It is about understanding what the space environment does to consciousness in the full range of its effects, the degrading and the transformative simultaneously, and designing missions that maximize the latter while mitigating the former. That is a more complete framing of the challenge than either the medical literature or the astronaut memoir literature alone provides. Every challenge in this account has been met at the institutional level, primarily with the same response: select better. Identify the individuals whose neurology, physiology, and psychology are most resistant to the degrading conditions of deep space. Put those people in the spacecraft. Trust the selection to carry the mission. This strategy has worked in the narrow sense that no crewed spaceflight mission has been lost to crew cognitive or psychological failure. The people who fly are genuinely extraordinary. Their resilience is genuine. But selection is not a solution to the consciousness problem in deep space, for reasons that accumulate from every section of this account. First, no degree of psychological resilience protects hippocampal neurons from galactic cosmic radiation. No cognitive baseline prevents the cerebrospinal fluid redistribution that causes intracranial pressure elevation and SANS. No emotional stability prevents the structural brain changes visible on MRI scans of returning long-duration crew. Selection filters the population for people who handle the consequences of these physiological realities most gracefully. It does not reduce the realities themselves. The radiation hits the neuron. The fluid shifts toward the head. The white matter changes. The selection process has no mechanism for preventing any of it. Second, the people who fly long-duration missions are specifically the people least likely to develop the behavioral and cognitive problems most likely to threaten such missions. Every data point in the space medicine literature on long-duration human performance comes from a sample constructed to minimize the very problems the data is being used to understand. The confidence interval around extrapolating from this exceptional sample to any broader future population, the crew of a second Mars mission, the rotating staff of a permanent Mars research station, the eventual inhabitants of any permanent Mars presence is enormous. We know what happens to the most psychologically resilient humans available when they spend a year in low Earth orbit. We have essentially no data on what happens to people closer to the center of the resilience distribution, because those people do not pass the selection criteria. The data from exceptional people is informative but not predictive for populations that are not constructed to be exceptional. The sociological analysis of this dynamic goes beyond individual risk assessment. When institutions define the primary response to a known environmental hazard as selecting people who can tolerate the hazard better than average, they create a structural incentive to characterize the hazard as a human factors problem rather than an engineering problem. Human factors problems are addressed through training, selection, and operational procedures, interventions that are relatively inexpensive compared to hardware engineering solutions and that do not require redesigning the vehicle or adding mass to the launch. Engineering solutions to environmental hazards shielding, artificial gravity, improved life support chemistry are expensive, technically complex, and compete with other engineering priorities for the mass budget and the development timeline. The institutional incentive in a resource-constrained environment runs toward the less expensive solution. Selection and training are the less expensive solution. Over time, in any complex socio-technical system, the less expensive solution tends to crowd out the more expensive one unless there is explicit institutional counterforce maintaining the priority of the engineering approach. The history of occupational health in industries from mining to aviation suggests that permanent improvement in worker safety comes not from selecting workers who tolerate hazardous conditions better, but from engineering the hazardous conditions out of the work environment. Applying that principle to the consciousness problem in deep space means investing in artificial gravity, in radiation countermeasures, in improved sleep support, in CO2 management, not because selection and training are inadequate, but because they address the symptom rather than the source. Third, when selection is the primary response to a known hazard, it locates responsibility for the hazard in the human rather than the system. It implies, even without stating it, that the problem is a human weakness to be compensated for by identifying sufficiently strong humans, rather than an environmental hazard to be addressed by engineering. This implication shapes where research investment flows, how risk is communicated to the public, and how the ethical framework for crew consent is constructed. Honest informed consent for a Mars mission requires that crew members understand not just the general category of cognitive risk that they are accepting, but the specific nature, magnitude, and likely timing of the impairments the available research predicts they will experience. Building that consent framework around specifics requires treating selection as one tool among several, rather than as the primary answer. Fourth, selection is not scalable beyond a small rotating research crew. The pool of people who meet current selection criteria for NASA long-duration missions is finite. Expanding human deep space activity to any scale beyond a handful of elite missions requires either relaxing those criteria, accepting the cognitive consequences for less resilient populations, or developing engineering, environmental, and pharmacological solutions that reduce the performance burden on resilience itself. The latter is more ethical, more scalable, and requires exactly the long-term institutional commitment that the consciousness problem deserves and has not yet fully received. The honest account of what current space medicine research reveals about the real limits of human consciousness in deep space arrives at a conclusion that is both uncomfortable and important. The architecture of a Mars mission as currently conceived is not well matched to the actual cognitive performance profile of the humans who will fly it across its full duration. This is a statement about design, not about courage. The people selected to fly to Mars will be among the most capable individuals in any field, in any era. What is in question is whether the system they are placed in adequately accounts for the cognitive trajectory that the available research predicts they will follow, and whether that accounting is reflected in specific engineering. Decisions, operational protocols, and risk mitigation strategies that address the mechanisms of impairment rather than simply filtering for people who handle impairment most gracefully. Circadian lighting systems that actively maintain circadian entrainment through the full transit duration, using LED spectra calibrated to the biological needs of each phase of the day-night cycle, are known to be effective from ISS research. They should be a mandatory minimum specification for any crewed deep space vehicle, not an optional upgrade traded against mass budget elsewhere. The engineering is understood. The only remaining question is whether decision makers treat them as essential. Structured autonomy protocols, formal, pre-negotiated frameworks that define which decisions the crew can make without ground consultation, developed and tested in realistic analog conditions before the first crew ever needs them in a real emergency, represent one of the most operationally urgent preparation gaps in current Mars mission planning. The International Space Station operates under a paradigm of continuous ground oversight that has served human spaceflight well, precisely because the station is close enough to Earth to make that paradigm viable. Every decision of consequence gets escalated. Every anomaly gets analyzed by specialist teams. Every crew member health concern gets reviewed by a flight surgeon who knows the individual and their history. This paradigm has become so embedded in the culture of spaceflight operations that the institutional adjustments required to replace it for a Mars mission, defining in advance which decisions the crew can make autonomously, at what confidence threshold, with what documentation have not been developed to the level of detail that an actual Mars mission would require. Developing those protocols means working through every category of contingency the mission might face, deciding which ones can be handled by an autonomous crew without real-time ground input, and validating those decisions through extensive simulation in communication delay conditions. That validation work requires analog facilities running Mars-class communication delays for mission-realistic durations, and those facilities have not yet been operated at the scale and duration that pre-mission validation would require. The gap between current institutional readiness for crew autonomy and the level of readiness a Mars mission demands is one of the least publicly discussed and most operationally significant preparation challenges in the entire mission. Architecture. Artificial gravity, through rotating spacecraft sections or tethered configurations, needs to move from a research concept to a mission architecture requirement. At what confidence thresholds? And what process governs decisions in ambiguous territory must replace the paradigm of continuous ground-based decision authority that assumes a communication latency that does not exist at Mars distances. These protocols need extensive validation in Mars communication delay conditions before the first crew depends on them in a real emergency. Artificial gravity, through rotating spacecraft sections or tethered configurations, needs to move from a research concept to a mission architecture requirement. The engineering complexity is real. So is the multi-year accumulation of intracranial pressure, brain structural change, bone loss, and cardiovascular deconditioning that its absence produces. The comparison between those two costs has not been worked through rigorously in any publicly available mission planning document. It should be. The pharmacological countermeasure program for radiation-induced cognitive change needs investment, validation timelines, and a clear definition of what ready to fly means before a crewed Mars mission departs. Laboratory findings are promising enough to justify clinical validation work. That work does not happen automatically. It requires institutional priority, not yet established at the scale the timeline demands. Crew training for the specific cognitive conditions the mission is expected to produce: the third quarter deterioration, the progressive sleep debt. The impaired insight into their own impairment needs integration into pre-mission preparation rather than treatment as a general psychological resilience topic. Crews that understand before launch that their cognitive processing speed will measurably decline during transit, that they should expect interpersonal friction in a specific mission phase and have practiced specific protocols for managing it, that their self-assessment of their own performance will systematically overestimate their actual performance, Those crews are better prepared for what the data predicts than crews trained to assume they will perform at their experience. Best because they are the best. None of this is an argument against going to Mars. It is an argument for going with eyes open for treating the cognitive and psychological limits of human consciousness in deep space with the same engineering seriousness applied to propulsion, life support, and thermal management. On the question of whether humanity will send people to Mars, the answer based on current hardware trajectories and institutional investment from multiple nations and commercial entities is almost certainly yes. The cognitive and psychological barriers to the specific mission of a short-duration first landing by a highly selected crew are manageable within the constraints of the mission being planned. But manageable is not the same as trivial, and the gap between manageable and ignored is exactly the gap that has preceded disasters in complex technical systems throughout the history of human exploration. The escalator assumption is as dangerous applied to Mars consciousness as it is applied to any other aspect of deep space development. Sending brave people to Mars does not automatically produce solutions to the cognitive impairments those people experience. Each solved problem in the history of human spaceflight has been solved because someone identified it explicitly, invested resources in understanding the mechanism, developed interventions targeted at that mechanism, and validated those interventions in realistic conditions before putting them in front of a crew. Sleep quality in space improved when circadian lighting systems replaced fluorescent lighting, not when crews were told to try harder to sleep. Bone loss improved when exercise protocols became more structured and targeted, not when astronauts were selected for better baseline bone density. SANS research accelerated when MRI imaging became standard in post-flight assessment and when the optic nerve findings were connected to a mechanism fluid shift and intracranial pressure that pointed toward specific countermeasures. Each advance required explicit identification of the problem, investment in understanding it, and engineering of a solution. The consciousness problem in deep space is not different in structure from these other problems. It is different in maturity. The identification has occurred, unevenly and incompletely, across the research literature. The investment in understanding the mechanisms is underway. The engineering of solutions is in earlier stages, and in some areas, artificial gravity, radiation, pharmaceutical countermeasures, autonomous behavioral health, monitoring the gap between research concept and validated space-qualified system, remains large enough that closing it before the first Mars crew departs would require a level of prioritization, investment that the current program architecture does not reflect. The first Mars crew will return changed, cognitively, psychologically, and neurologically, in ways that the current evidence base characterizes incompletely, and the mission planning process accounts for partially. They will return with data that no research program running on Earth can generate, and that data will make the second crew safer, and the second mission's data will make the third safer. And through this iteration, mission by mission, data point by data point, failure absorbed, and success, built upon the consciousness problem, will gradually yield to the same combination of courage, science, and engineering that has resolved every previous problem in the history of human spaceflight. The first crew will not solve it. They will begin solving it by going, by returning, and by bringing back the evidence that the next generation of space medicine researchers will use to understand what Mars actually does to the human mind. That is an extraordinary contribution, even if it is not the triumphant, fully prepared execution that the public narrative of space exploration prefers. The Apollo 13 crisis is often invoked as the model for human performance under pressure in deep space. On April 13th, 1970, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded, catastrophically damaging the spacecraft's power and life support systems approximately 330,000 kilometers from Earth. The crew of Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert had to improvise a return trajectory using the lunar module as a lifeboat, manage a carbon dioxide buildup using mismatched components and a manual that did not exist, endure freezing temperatures, and re-enter Earth's atmosphere in a damaged capsule whose re-entry systems had never been tested under those conditions. They succeeded. The mission was described as a successful failure, and it is still the foundational demonstration of what extraordinary human performance under pressure in space can achieve. Apollo 13 lasted approximately 6 days. The crew was coherent, cooperative, and functioning at high cognitive level throughout the crisis. The ground was in continuous real-time communication. The mission end was clear and imminent. Every minute of work pointed at a goal that could be understood and measured. A Mars mission psychiatric or medical crisis looks nothing like Apollo 13. It does not announce itself with an explosion. It develops slowly, invisibly, in people who are already cognitively impaired by the accumulated stresses of a year or more, in the most demanding environment humans have ever occupied. It is managed not by a ground team in real-time communication, but by the crew themselves, with whatever resources they have on board and whatever cognitive capacity they have remaining. The distance between those two scenarios is the distance between what the public narrative of deep space medicine imagines and what the research says the actual situation will be. The human brain is not a passenger on a Mars mission. It is the mission. Every sensor reading that must be interpreted, every emergency that must be diagnosed, every engineering judgment that must be made, every interpersonal tension that must be navigated, every critical moment, from the landing approach to the return launch, everything runs through 3 pounds of tissue that has been absorbing galactic cosmic radiation for 20 months, operating on 6 hours of fragmented sleep, breathing elevated CO2 in a sealed metal environment, managing the psychological consequences of the most prolonged isolation any human crew has experienced, and slowly, measurably, structurally changing in response to conditions its evolutionary history did not prepare it for. That brain will be asked, when the moment arrives, to perform at the level the mission requires. And the most important question in human spaceflight right now, more important than whether the rocket is powerful enough, more important than whether the heat shield will survive re-entry, is whether the brain behind the controls is the same instrument that launched. The evidence suggests it will not be identical. It will be measurably changed in its fluid distribution, in its white matter organization, in its hippocampal neurogenesis, in its dendritic complexity, in its sleep architecture, in its emotional regulation capacity, in its processing speed and working memory performance. The evidence suggests these changes will be subtle enough that the crew will likely not notice them in daily experience, pronounced enough to appear on standardized cognitive testing and advanced brain imaging, and consequential enough to matter in the execution of complex tasks under time pressure and stress. The universe is vast and silent and indifferent to the ambitions of the small creatures who have recently developed the capability to leave the planet it placed them on. It does not make the journey easier because the travelers are brave. It does not spare the neurons of exceptional people from cosmic radiation because their country invested billions in their training. It does not preserve the circadian rhythms of selected, screened, optimized crew members because the mission timeline depends on their performance. It does what physics does, consistently and without variation. What we can control is the preparation, how honestly we characterize the risks, how systematically we research the mechanisms, how seriously we engineer the countermeasures, and how accurately we communicate the current state of understanding to the people who will accept those risks on behalf of a species reaching, for the first time in its history, for a world beyond its own. Honest preparation begins with honest language. When the public narrative around a Mars mission consistently uses words like manageable and challenges to describe findings that a neurologist reviewing the same data would describe as structural brain changes, cognitive performance decline, and chronic intracranial pressure elevation, the language is doing work that protects institutional momentum at the expense of institutional preparation. The people who will fly to Mars deserve better than language that softens what the data actually shows. They deserve an institutional environment in which the findings are stated clearly, the gaps in countermeasure development are acknowledged explicitly, And the resources allocated to closing those gaps reflect the same level of urgency that is applied to every other system the mission depends on. The brain behind the controls is a system. It deserves to be treated like one. The first Mars crew will reach. They will travel through conditions that will change them in specific, documented, partially predictable ways. They will land on a planet where no human being has stood. They will conduct science, navigate emergencies, manage conflict, grieve the distance, marvel at the view, and work day after day in the most extraordinary workplace in human history. And they will return, if everything goes as designed, carrying data that will begin answering the questions this account has asked. The going begins now, and the preparation for what the going will do to the minds of those who attempt it should begin with the same urgency, the same investment, and the same honest reckoning with the evidence that has made every previous advance in human exploration possible. The history of human exploration at extreme physical limits offers a consistent lesson. The expeditions that succeeded were not the ones with the most courageous people, though courage was necessary. They were the ones with the most honest assessment of what the environment would demand and the most thorough preparation to meet those demands. Amundsen reached the South Pole and returned safely because he studied the environment, talked to people who knew it, prepared for the specific conditions he would encounter, and built a team and a logistics chain matched to those conditions. Scott had equally courageous people and less thorough preparation, and the outcome was different. The Mars mission will require both courage and preparation. The courage is not in question. The preparation is where the gap currently exists, and where the investment of the coming years needs to go. Not to the exclusion of rocket propulsion and heat shield design, which also matter enormously, but in addition to them, with the same rigor, the same institutional priority, and the same honest acknowledgement of the difference between what we currently know and what we will need to know before we can honestly say the mission is as prepared as it can be. That is the real work, not the rocket work, the harder work, the work that will determine whether the first people who reach Mars are the same people who land there in the ways that matter most. The universe is not asking for our bravery. It already has that. It has had that since Gagarin. What deep space is asking for now, at 80 million kilometers from home? In a sealed metal tube with 5 colleagues and a communication delay that makes Earth effectively a memory, is something harder to manufacture than bravery. It is asking for the brain to keep working. That is the frontier. That is where the real preparation must happen. And it starts, as all real preparation starts, with telling the truth about what we are preparing for.